So I'm going to talk about family poverty instead of the brain, because that's something I do know a little bit about. And it all goes back actually to the era that Suzanne highlighted of the 1960s and the Beatles, when I started my first job, which was on a follow-up survey of Seabourn Roundtree's survey of York, looking at poverty. I hasten to add, this was not the 1899 one. It doesn't go back as far as that. And of course, Roundtree was keen on identifying this sort of inevitable movement in and out of poverty, with the older generation being the ones who predominantly suffered. Once you stopped work, that was it. And then you relied on the younger generation, the working age adults, to give you some support. And what I thought about the other day was how much that has changed, the amazing difference that we now have on that. So I've called it a reversal of misfortune because it's pretty bad whoever got it. So in the past, when elderly parents were poor and the children helped out, and now we've got the situation where the working age group, the younger generation are poor, and it's the elderly parents who help to best of their advantage. And I'll show you how and why that has happened. Drawing on quite a lot of research that we've done over the past few years, my job as a researcher, including, I must say, the Growing Up in Scotland survey, because I've relied quite heavily on that at times. And these two pieces that we've done quite recently, last year in fact, at the Tavistock. One was with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as part of their anti-poverty strategy, which was looking at a review on the links between personal relationships and poverty. And the other one was for the UK government, which was an evaluation of relationship support, both of which I think are available online. And they've been quite informative. Also informative has been a range of newspaper headings. And these are the ones that I've collected just over the past few months. It's amazing how many, depends which newspaper you read, of course, you'll probably identify the Guardian headlines here, highlighting the problems that we're talking about here. So I just collected those, but I think it's quite important to think about who is poor at the moment. So the actual numbers. Now there are loads of measures of measuring what we call income deprivation or disadvantage or poverty, whatever you want to call it these days. I've chosen this one method, which is the most commonly used, the oldest method, which is the relative low income one of 60% below the median. And I've chosen that because I think it's probably best to illustrate how one sector of society compares with another in terms of poverty. So it's the easiest one really to look at. And we can use either before housing costs with that measure or after housing costs. And the latest government figures for that are 2012, 13, the 2014 ones aren't down yet. If you look at the after housing cost one, there are about 13 million people in poverty after housing costs. About 1.6 million of those are pensioner households, which is about 13% of all pensioner households. If you look at before housing costs, the numbers about 9,500, so, and over half of those are working age adult households. So quite a difference there. So you're probably wondering why we're mixing things up, why we're using after housing costs for one and before housing costs for the other, and that's because that's what the government likes to do. Because they like to use after housing costs for the pensioners, because they say 3/4 of them earn their own home, skillfully ignoring the quarter who don't, of course. But this is more meaningful when you're comparing them with adult working age groups. But you can see why from this simple little table here, why that happens. Because if you look at the before housing costs for pensioners, they go up to 16,000. But if you look at the after housing costs for working families, then they zero up to 21% from the 15%. And it's even worse for children, where it goes up to 27%, which is enormously high. And one of the things that's really happened over the past few years, I remember talking about this at the previous Parenting Across Scotland conference, which is some time ago now, is the number of children in poverty in working families, in well, even just one parent works, and the poverty that's accruing now. So you can see why the government fudges these figures slightly, because that figure is enormously high and clearly isn't going to be met by any targets to reduce child poverty. So what happened? Why are the poor a bit less poor, and why are the not so poor slightly better off? It's a bit of a reversal. And there are various factors, and I've just chosen these 4 here because I think they're quite relevant to what we've been talking about today, and including a bit of distribution. So looking first at policy, which I think has a lot to answer for here. I could fill the whole half hour just talking about policy. It tends to give it a hobby horse. And the previous government, for all its many faults, and I'm not suggesting it was perfect, used a system of alleviating child poverty with fiscal means, a combination of tax and benefits put together, and succeeded in lifting over 1 million children out of poverty. Now, that was nowhere near the amount that they were aiming for, and they got criticised for that, of course. But nevertheless, they did something. Now, the current government, which is 210 till question mark, but it's soon be made, don't think that fiscal means are the appropriate method. That's not the way to do it. They don't like that. You need to use the root causes of poverty, what they call the root causes of poverty. And the root causes of poverty, according to them, are things like an entrenched welfare dependency, a transmission of low income, what they like to call a cycle of deprivation. That term was first coined in the 1970s for use here, has sort of come back to haunt us. There's dependence on money for nothing. They don't think you can have that. And the solution for the current government is work, obviously, works the route out of poverty, strong and stable families, which is the other thing, so that if children live in strong and stable families with working parents, then they will be spared all the hardship, disadvantage, inconvenience, whatever you want to call it, of parents who don't work, of parents who separate, lone parents, remarriage, all those issues which cause all the problems. And that sort of skips over quite a few issues, I think. Both governments did attempt to look after pensioners, originally just protecting pensions. The current government even more so. So pensioners have been well looked after, well, better looked after. So what would help here? Well, for a start, a sufficient number of jobs. I mean, there's no point in working through it out of poverty when there aren't any jobs for people. So that would be the first thing, I think. And jobs at a reasonable wage, not the minimum wage or even worse, and certainly not zero contract hours jobs, which are absolutely impossible for anyone to manage. You can't cope with those. You can't plan, you can't budget. Universal credit, I mean, far be it from me to praise anything that Ian Duncan Smith dreams up, but I think the theory is good. This idea that you can ease the transition between welfare and work, I think it's good in theory. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any good practice yet. We haven't seen a lot of practice, and what we have seen hasn't been great. But it could work. If that worked well, eventually, it might make a difference. I think a bit of compassion with them on this here. I mean, we think we all live on these dreadfully harsh benefit sanctions, which local job centre offices, they introduce these. They say, no, it's not policy, but nevertheless they do it. And the most trivial offences, and lastly goes at a young fathers group, the most awful things that these poor young fathers are being sanctioned for, which have no benefit to anybody. And then there's a couple of structural things, which are parental leave and childcare, and altering those might make a difference, and I'll come on to those later. But those would enable mothers to have paid work if they wanted to, and I'm always stressing if they want to, because I'm not suggesting that mothers should be at work by any means. So those things would make a difference. I'm just going to move on now. On to children. Children was the next point. Now, we talk about loving relationships, and obviously children arise out of loving relationships in some cases. And they really change the picture of a family's relationship altogether, not just because they cost money. The outcome of that is typically that fathers continue working, often work more hours because they need more money, and mothers stay at home and look after the children. That's the general picture. I'm not saying everybody does that, but that's the general picture. And sometimes that's from preference, which is fine, if that's what people choose, but it's not always from preference. And a couple of things get in the way there. And one is the childcare. The phenomenally high cost of childcare in this country, which is about now, the latest figures I read were £115 just for 25 hours in a nursery, slightly less if you use a childminder. But it's still, as a proportion of the average wage, one of the highest in all the 27 EU countries. So that makes it a pretty expensive option. And of course it's variable quality, so childcare isn't a sort of wonderful thing anyway. The quality is variable, the availability is variable. So it's not a sort of God-given thing that if you found it and you could afford it, it would be great. And then there's this discrepancy between maternity and paternity leave, that women get quite long leave entitlement. Whether they take it up or not, they have an entitlement, which can be up to 50 weeks if they want it. Admittedly, it's not well paid after the first 6 weeks, but it is paid, and it's quite long. Fathers get 2 weeks at a very miserable rate of pay. So not a great incentive to swap roles and for mothers to go out to work. But that can be quite damaging for women's future chances of being in the job market, because if you've been out of the job market for 50 weeks, and sometimes even longer, it's quite difficult to get back in there if you're just, reliant on people's goodwill. We don't have enough protection of unemployment law for that. So what would help here? Well, obviously, more childcare, high quality, affordable, and make it so that more women could use it if they wanted to. I mean, apparently it's about 73% of women in the UK say they can't afford childcare for their under-school-age children. And the average across Europe is only about 50%, so you can see what a difference that makes. And different leave provision, so that mothers and fathers can take as much leave as they want at a reasonably well-paid rate. Now, this doesn't mean the much trumpeted shared parental leave that's coming in next month. That really isn't the answer to the problem, because if it's shared and transferable, then fathers are under pressure often from employers to stay at work, to carry on working, and mothers just take up the lion's share because they quite like being at home by and large. So it won't work in terms of equalising or altering that relationship between employment and childcare that's been a feature of life for so long. I don't think it'll make very much difference, and the rate of pay isn't great. So I don't think many fathers are going to stay at home for £138 a week. It's not staggeringly important to them. But it does matter, those sort of things matter, because it alters who, not just the current income, but also the future income of families often depend on those initial decisions. So getting that right would really have helped quite a bit. And a word about parental relationships. Previous government was a bit neutral on relationships, as long as families were living together. They weren't particularly hung up on whether it was cohabitation or marriage. And the current government obviously is hung up on marriage. They think that marriage is the solution to family relationships. And witnessed by the fact that they have now introduced a transferable tax allowance. Apparently this amounts to the princely sum of £4 a week, which I'm not quite sure is worth getting married for, but maybe it's supposed to be, put it that way. But they say it's not about the money. But the message there is that if they say it's not about the money, it's to send a signal that they support the institution of marriage because of its proven advantages for children. So I think that means they've nailed their colours very firmly to that must. But it doesn't matter whether it's your first, second, third, fourth marriage, it's being married that they say count, which I think is quite interesting. want to do a bit of philandering. As long as you move on to the next one. In fact, marriages have increased over the past few years, even though the number of children born to cohabiting parents is increasing, still the number of marriages has increased. I mean, I saw it in Scotland, it was the highest for 4 years at some point. It's in England and Wales, it's gone up by a couple of %. So people are getting married. About a quarter of those are remarriages, interestingly. Remarriage is quite common after divorce and separation, especially for women, which I'll say a bit about in a moment. So people are getting married, amazingly. Perhaps they all want their £4 a week, but there we are. On the other hand, marriage, apart from the £4, isn't really an anti-poverty strategy. It doesn't solve problems. I mean, it might be nice at the time, and especially if you have a party, but it doesn't actually solve the problems of living with a low income. And last year we did this study called The State of the UK Relationships, which I think involves Scotland as well, if I remember rightly. And 62% of the 5,000 odd people that they talked to said that worries about money were the biggest strain on their relationship, which is understandable, because if you're short of money, it is a terrible strain. You get a bit grumpy with each other, you fall out, you become not supportive to each other, the relationship becomes unhappy. It's pretty obvious, it's just another strain, isn't it? So, what would help? Well, I think more relationship support, amazingly. We did the study last year for the government, which looked not just at couple counselling when things go haywire, but it looked at a couple of other interventions which were about relationship strengthening behaviours and attitudes. One was for first-time parents, and one was for couples before marriage. And we were a bit sort of doubtful about these when we set off on this track for evaluating them. But in fact, you know, we found that they worked. They worked, and all three of these interventions seemed to work in strengthening relationships, making people work better together. They could avoid some relationships ending, or they could postpone the ending of the relationship. And if they did end, people seemed to do it more amicably. So there was something in it there, I think. I mean, amazingly, couples liked them, but I mean, that was only after they'd overcome their initial reluctance. There were some very funny stories from people we interviewed about walking around the block 6 times and making sure the neighbours weren't looking, and, you know, all those anxieties that you have about accessing couple counselling. And I think particularly, I should add, although we're not talking about this, but particularly acute for some ethnic groups who have really struggled with this, where it just wasn't acceptable within their culture. It does potentially save money, and this is the much misquoted figure. I noticed that IDS was quoting it only last week. It does save money, but only if it prevents the costs associated with relationship breakdown and the consequences. So when we came up with this figure, it was looking at all the things that come after relationship breakdown, not just the costs of divorce, but healthcare and all sorts of things. So that's a sort of caveat, if you like. But it should really try to remove the stigma associated with it, so you don't have to walk around the block 6 times. It should really support relationships, all types of relationship, regardless of status, and it should really make more of an effort to reach low-income families. I mean, the middle classes are quite good at seeking help, most of them, whereas I think people who are not so well off don't do that quite so well, and it needs a bit more of an effort to get out there to them. And then what happens when relationships do become unloving? Well, divorce rates are higher, obviously, when money is tight, it's too much of a strain, and relationships do end. But divorce and separation also bring poverty with them very often, and that's for the whole family. And mothers have the childcare, and they have the problems of not having necessarily been in the labour market, trying to get back into employment, looking after the children without any support, maintenance that's paid sometimes and sometimes not. And they often get very depressed. We all get depressed when relationships go awry, and that obviously impacts even further on their employment prospects and their ability to stay in employment. They do tend to get out of it rather, sooner rather than later on the whole, but nevertheless it's crippling for a time. Now, I think Suzanne mentioned earlier about fathers who tend to get a bit overlooked in this, and particularly after divorce and separation. Fathers don't seem to enter into this. In fact, fathers suffer depression far more, for far longer than women do, with quite serious consequences, as a recent report from Samaritan showed. It is a cause of suicide amongst a certain age group. And that's particularly compounded where fathers don't have serious and continuing access with their children. And that's compounded because the housing is often insecure. They fall foul of the dreaded bedroom tax, which means that they can't have a spare room for their children to stay. Any benefits associated with the separated families only go to the designated parent, which is with the mother. So they do have a particularly rough time and tend not to get the attention that they need. Now, remarriage can solve that problem. As I said before, a lot of marriages are remarriages, but only on a temporary basis, because they are more prone to end. I'm not saying they all end, but they're more prone to end, and income fluctuates over the life cycle, particularly if there's another family being supported in the background. So there's some solution to that, but it's not totally the answer. What we think might be the answer, what we thought was the answer, we evaluated something called child poverty pilots some time ago, and we come with a lot of evaluations that we do. The plug is pulled on the actual thing that we're evaluating before we finish the task, and this was one of them, but we thought it was really good because it was offering holistic support to everybody in the family. It wasn't directed at mothers, it was directed at mothers, fathers, children. It gave financial advice, legal advice, also, and emotional advice. It was really a useful thing, wickedly expensive because it was a pilot, nobody's work coming through just yet, but nevertheless showed great promise. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to be looking at, to be able to see the family as a whole at this time. It does lead to better relationships. It means that child maintenance is more likely to be paid, which is great, and just leads to greater stability. So those sort of things would make quite a difference, I think. And I think doing away with this charge for the child maintenance service is an absolute must. I mean, it's wicked really, because it's terribly punitive for those who can least afford it. You know, if you want to sort out your child maintenance, you can't afford to go there because you've got to pay for it now. Dreadful. So that's the doom and gloom. That's the misery bit. So now I'm going to cheer you up with the rescue mission. And who is this flying in here? Now this is Grandma flying in to solve the problem. It should be Grandad as well, because Grandad does do his bit. But Grandad usually comes with Grandma, so she's the instigator of it. There are some exceptions to this, and I know some. By and large, it is Grandma and Grandad following behind, and they're the good fairies here. And grandmothers in particular are the main source of informal childcare for children below and above school age. And particularly this is for wraparound care, where they take the children to school or nursery in the morning, pick them up, collect them in the evening, and have them during school holidays. When they're sick, and all those sorts of things that are terribly important to working mothers. And it actually goes across all socio-economic groups, the grandmother care. And partly because it's built on trust and understanding and shared values. And of course, as any mother knows, nobody will love your child as much as you do, except your own mother. And there's that bond, I think, with grandmothers and grandchildren. But because it's free, it's most commonly used by the less well off. They're really much more dependent on it, so it's vital for them. It can be a lifesaver for allowing them to be in employment if they want to be. But it does come at a cost, because Grandma often isn't terribly well paid herself, gives up work, shortens the hours, does something, some sort of jiggery-pokery so she can fit in with childcare as well. So there is a price to be paid at the other end. And now, of course, Grandma's got to work a bit longer because the state retirement age is going up to the point where she could claim a pension rises. So there's going to be a bit of a hiatus here. And you need to be young and fit to do this job, I promise you. It's not a job when you're not feeling great. And it's not just childcare, it's money as well. I mean, they provide money. which is quite amazing. Now this is quite a difference from how it was in Seabrook Roundtree's day, which was 2 months before, where we had the money going upwards. Now the money is going downwards. There have been lots of adverse comments about pensioners, and we've never had it so good, we still, the family still, we had free education, and then we earn our own homes, and then we get good pensions, and then we get all these freebies like prescriptions and travel and bonus at Christmas. Oh, you name it, we get it. It's very nice, but I think the crucial thing to remember here is that we tend not to keep it to ourselves. It does actually go out of the door just about as soon as it comes in, and it goes downwards to adult children and grandchildren. And that makes a large difference to their lives. And strangely enough, the research shows that grandparents give even more when the state provides essential services. So in Scandinavian countries where the services are more generous, the parents shell out more because it's voluntary, I suppose. So what would help here? Well, more childcare, obviously, so that both mothers and grannies can work if they want to. And at least bring us up to the European level, where, in Denmark, for example, 77% of mothers with children up to the age of 3 are using childcare, whereas here it's about 1/3, and slowly decreasing because of the cost. I mean, maintaining these state pensions at a reasonable level, I think is, I would say, but I think from a family policy perspective, it is quite important, because it's not just that the money is going out, it's saving the adult children from spending money on supporting their parents as well, so there's a cost benefit here. And I think a bit of stopping granny bashing. I mean, actually, we are doing the best we can, even in the difficult circumstances. There's another of my final one of my newspaper headlines, or something that at least saw the light, I felt, which was quite helpful. There was another one at the weekend as well, too late to include here, which was from the Council of Mortgage Lenders, which says that more than half of first-time house buyers in 2014 were likely to have got help from the bank of mum and dad, so they were sort of helping to get children onto the ladder. So that's my argument, which is that it looks as though work really isn't the route out of poverty, after all. That it might be for somebody, it isn't for everybody. And it certainly isn't when we have this rather uncoordinated mess of disparate things going on, and no childcare, and families are unsupported. But what grandparents of the older generation can do, because I think on the whole, being part of that 60s, slightly hippie-ish generation, a bit altruistic sometimes, I think that they are able to give money and to help the younger generation. And I think that's a source of help that really should be tapped into rather than disparaged. And I think that forms a pretty good and loving relationship. Thank you.